Imagine a transaction so legendary, it's been told in classrooms for nearly 4 centuries. $24. That's what we've been told the Dutch paid for Manhattan Island in 1626. But what if I told you that this iconic story, this cornerstone of American capitalism, is built on a lie? Not just a misunderstanding, but perhaps one of history's greatest con jobs. The legend goes like this. Peter Minuit, director of the Dutch West India Company, met with local Indians and purchased the entire island for 60 guilders worth of trade goods. Beads, tools, cloth, the equivalent of about $24. It became the ultimate symbol of Native American naivete, the deal of the millennium. For generations, we've laughed at this story. We've used it to paint indigenous peoples as simple, unsophisticated, easily fooled. But here's what they didn't teach you in school. The Native Americans who made this deal, they were the Canarsie. In Manhattan, they didn't live there. The island was actually inhabited by the Wet'suwet'en people. The Canarsie essentially sold the Dutch something they had no right to sell. Imagine walking up to someone and selling them the Brooklyn Bridge. Now imagine actually pulling it off. That's what happened here. The Dutch thought they were getting the deal of a lifetime, but they'd just been hustled by indigenous entrepreneurs who understood something profound. They understood that the Dutch concept of land ownership was foreign, absurd even. In their worldview, you can't own the earth any more than you can own the sky. So why not take valuable goods from these strange newcomers in exchange for nothing, for a concept that didn't exist in their world? This isn't a story about Native American foolishness. This is a story about a brilliant con, a clash of worldviews, and how history gets written by those who think they won. The $24 myth has endured because it serves a narrative. But the truth is so much more fascinating. Welcome to the real story of the Manhattan Purchase, where everything you thought you knew is about to be turned upside down. The year is 1621. While pilgrims struggle to survive in Plymouth, a different kind of colonizer sets their sights on the New World. The Dutch West India Company, a corporate empire dressed in the velvet robes of commerce, gazes hungrily at the Hudson River Valley. This isn't about religious freedom. This is about beaver pelts, timber, and the ruthless mathematics of profit. The Dutch have already built an empire spanning from the Spice Islands to Brazil. Now they want Manhattan. Peter Minuit arrives in 1626 as the newly appointed Director General. His orders are clear: establish permanent settlement, secure the land, and make it profitable, by any means necessary. What Minuit doesn't understand, what none of the Dutch understand, is that they're about to negotiate with the wrong people entirely. The intricate web of indigenous politics, territory, and ownership is invisible to European eyes. The Lenape people have lived here for thousands of years. They call this island Mannahatta, the land of many hills. But the Lenape have neighbors, rivals, and a complex system of land rights that no European bothers to learn. Enter the Canarsie tribe. They live primarily in what we now call Brooklyn and Queens. They visit Manhattan, they trade on Manhattan, but here's the crucial detail: they don't actually control Manhattan. But the Canarsie are opportunists. They see these strange pale men arriving with axes, cloth, and metal goods. They see an opportunity too good to refuse. They're about to execute one of history's greatest real estate scams. The Dutch believe they're being clever, buying an entire island for 60 guilders worth of trade goods. Beads, cloth, kettles, axes. In their minds, they're stealing from savages who don't understand value. The irony is exquisite. While the Dutch congratulate themselves on their shrewd negotiation, the Canarsie are laughing all the way back to Brooklyn. They've just sold land they have no right to sell. The real owners, the Wet'suwet'en band of the Lenape, watch from the northern part of the island, completely unaware that their land has just been purchased without their knowledge or consent. This isn't just a footnote in history. This is a masterclass in how colonial arrogance creates blind spots large enough to sail a ship through. The Dutch assumed all Indians were interchangeable. That territory worked like European property law. Within months, the consequences will unfold. The Wet'suwet'en will demand payment for land the Dutch believe they've already bought. Tensions will escalate. Blood will be spilled. All because nobody asked the simple question: who actually owns this land? The Canarsie tribe. Skilled traders from what is now Brooklyn and Long Island. They watched the Dutch arrive with their strange ships, their hunger for land written across their faces. But here's what Peter Minuit didn't know. The Canarsie were visitors to Manhattan, seasonal guests. The island belonged to the Lenape bands who actually lived there, the Wetquaesgeeks, the Rekkawonks. Imagine the audacity. The Canarsie saw an opportunity that would make any modern con artist jealous. These Dutch strangers didn't understand indigenous land concepts. They didn't know who owned what. To the Lenape peoples, land wasn't property to be sold. It was a living entity, shared and stewarded. The concept of exclusive ownership was as foreign as the Dutch themselves. But the Canarsie understood something crucial. They understood desire. They saw what the Dutch wanted to hear, and they were willing to tell them exactly that. For 60 guilders worth of trade goods, beads, tools, cloth, the Canarsie agreed to sell Manhattan. They signed marks on papers they couldn't read, agreeing to terms that made no sense in their worldview. And then they left. Back to Brooklyn, back to the lands they actually inhabited, leaving the Dutch to celebrate a purchase that would soon prove far more complicated than they ever imagined. The real Manhattan Lenape? They hadn't been consulted. They hadn't agreed. They would soon discover that strangers had sold their home out from under them. This wasn't a simple case of natives being tricked by colonizers. This was layers of deception, cultural misunderstanding, and opportunism from multiple sides. The Canarsie had pulled off what might be history's most legendary real estate scam. They sold something they didn't own to buyers who didn't understand what they were buying. May 24th, 1626. The morning sun casts long shadows across the southern tip of Manhattan. Peter Minuit, the newly appointed director of New Netherland, stands before a group of indigenous leaders, his leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm. The Dutch believe they're conducting business with the Lenape who inhabit this island. But here's where history gets interesting. The men accepting their trade goods? They're likely Canarsie people from Long Island. The Canarsie had no more right to sell Manhattan than you or I have to sell the Brooklyn Bridge today. They were essentially opportunistic intermediaries who saw confused Europeans and seized a lucrative moment. 60 guilders worth of trade goods changed hands that day. Glass beads, iron tools, cloth. The Dutch recorded it meticulously, believing they'd just purchased 22,000 acres of prime real estate. But the Lenape who actually lived on Manhattan, they watched from a distance, utterly bewildered. In their worldview, land wasn't property to be sold. It was a living entity to be shared, respected, and stewarded. To them, the entire concept of the transaction was absurd. It would be like someone trying to sell you the sky, or the rain, or the wind itself. The philosophical gulf between these two cultures was wider than the Atlantic Ocean. The Canarsie took their payment and returned to Long Island, likely amazed at the gullibility of these pale-skinned strangers who believed paper and ceremony could transfer ownership of Mother Earth. Meanwhile, Minuit prepared his triumphant letter to the Dutch West India Company, convinced he'd just secured one of history's greatest real estate deals. Little did he know, he'd been brilliantly outmaneuvered. The real Lenape inhabitants of Manhattan would soon discover they had unexpected neighbors who claimed ownership through a sale they never authorized. The stage was set for centuries of misunderstanding, conflict, and displacement. History would remember this as the Dutch purchasing Manhattan for $24. But the truth, it was the greatest real estate scam in American history, and the Europeans were the ones who got played. While Peter Minuit celebrated his supposed bargain and the Canarsie counted their guilders, there was a third party to this transaction, a party that knew nothing of the deal being struck in their name. The Wetquaesgeek, the actual inhabitants of Manhattan's northern regions, the true stewards of the land the Dutch now claimed as theirs. Their villages dotted the landscape from what we now call Yonkers down through Upper Manhattan. They had lived here for generations, fishing the rivers, hunting the forests, cultivating the land. The Wetquaesgeek had a sophisticated understanding of territory and ownership. They knew every stream, every hunting ground, every sacred site. This was their home. But in 1626, in a small room at the southern tip of the island, their rights were being traded away. without their knowledge, without their consent, without even their presence. The Canarsie had no more right to sell Manhattan than a resident of Brooklyn would have to sell the Bronx today. It simply wasn't theirs to give. Some historians believe the Canarsie knew exactly what they were doing, selling something they didn't own to people who didn't understand the rules. The perfect con. Others suggest it was a cultural misunderstanding so profound that both sides thought they were getting the better deal. Two worlds, speaking different languages about ownership itself. But for the Wequa's geek, there was no deal at all. They would wake up one morning to find that their world had been sold from under them by strangers. Within months, Dutch settlers would begin pushing northward, claiming land the Wequa's geek had never agreed to relinquish. The collision was inevitable. This wasn't just a real estate transaction gone wrong. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat across an entire continent. Treaties signed with the wrong tribes, agreements made with those who had no authority to agree. The Wequesgeek would resist, they would fight. But they were battling against a system that had already decided they didn't own what was theirs. The Dutch saw parchment and signatures. The Lenape saw ceremony and relationship. Two worlds stood face to face on Manhattan's shore, speaking entirely different languages of possession. For the Dutch, land was commodity. It could be bought, sold, fenced, and owned absolutely. A plot on a map, a number in a ledger, property that would appreciate in value. They came from a nation that had literally created itself from the sea, building dikes and claiming land foot by foot. To them, transforming nature into property was not just legal, it was righteous. But the Lenape lived in a different universe entirely. Land was not owned, it was inhabited, it was used, it was shared, like asking someone to purchase the sky or own the wind. Their word for land, Lenapehoking, meant the place where the Lenape people live, not the place the Lenape people own. The distinction was everything. In Lenape culture, you could no more sell exclusive rights to land than you could sell your grandmother. The earth was maternal, ancestral, alive with the spirits of those who came before. When the Lenape accepted those 60 guilders worth of goods, they believed they were granting permission to use the land alongside them, to share the hunting grounds, to coexist. The Dutch believed they were purchasing exclusive, permanent ownership. The Lenape believed they were accepting gifts for temporary shared access. Both left that meeting satisfied they had gotten the better deal. This wasn't merely a misunderstanding. It was a collision between fundamentally incompatible worldviews, cosmologies that couldn't be translated, no matter how many interpreters stood between them. And in that gap between understanding, in that void where two realities failed to meet, the seeds of centuries of conflict were planted on Manhattan soil. The summer of 1626 faded into autumn, and Peter Minuit stood on the southern tip of Manhattan, watching Dutch settlers erect crude wooden structures. He believed he'd secured a paradise for 60 guilders worth of trade goods, but whispers were beginning to spread through the colony. The Lenape who'd accepted the payment had vanished back into the interior. They weren't returning to negotiate boundaries or discuss land rights, because they had never intended to. The land wasn't theirs to sell. The Wequesgeek people, who actually inhabited and controlled much of Manhattan, arrived at the Dutch settlement with confusion turning to anger. Through translators, a devastating truth emerged. The Dutch had negotiated with the wrong tribe entirely. Imagine the sinking feeling in Minuit's chest, the realization washing over him like cold harbor water. He hadn't purchased Manhattan. He'd been part of history's most audacious real estate con. The Canarsie tribe had played the Dutch brilliantly. They'd accepted valuable European goods for land they had no claim to, knowing they'd be long gone before the truth surfaced. It was a scam that would echo through centuries. Now the Dutch faced a choice: admit their mistake to the West India Company back in Amsterdam, or pay again. Pride and pragmatism dictated the latter. They would have to renegotiate, this time with the actual inhabitants of Manhattan. Over the following months and years, the Dutch found themselves paying multiple times for the same land, negotiating with different Lenape bands, each with legitimate claims to various parts of the island. The 60 guilder purchase became a cascade of payments. But here's the deeper irony. Even the Wekwijik didn't understand what the Dutch meant by purchase. In Lenape culture, land couldn't be owned, only used and shared. They thought they were granting temporary access, not surrendering possession forever. Two worldviews, separated not just by language, but by fundamental understandings of ownership, property, and humanity's relationship with the earth. A collision that would define the next 4 centuries of American history. The scam, if we can even call it that, revealed something profound. Perhaps the Canarsie weren't con artists. Perhaps they were the only ones who truly understood that you cannot sell what cannot be owned. They simply took payment for the absurd. For nearly 4 centuries, we've told ourselves a simple story. The naive natives, dazzled by trinkets worth 60 guilders, surrendered Manhattan for beads and axes. But what if the real con was far more sophisticated than anyone imagined? The Lenape understood something the Dutch couldn't fathom. Land wasn't property to be owned. It was a living entity to be shared. When they accepted those goods, they weren't selling anything. They were accepting gifts for temporary use rights. Here's where the scam gets brilliant. The Lenape who made the deal? The Canarsie tribe. They were from Brooklyn, not Manhattan. They were selling hunting rights to land that belonged to the Wekwijik people. Imagine the audacity. It's like your neighbor selling your house to a foreign investor, pocketing the cash and disappearing. The Canarsie walked away with Dutch goods for land they had no authority to transfer. But the Dutch? They believed they'd purchased exclusive ownership, a concept that didn't exist in Lenape culture. 2 completely different transactions happening simultaneously in the minds of each party. When the actual Manhattan inhabitants, the Wekwijik, showed up expecting to use their traditional lands, the Dutch were outraged. "We bought this," they insisted. The Wekwijik were equally confused. From whom? The Dutch ended up paying again and again. Multiple tribes received goods for the same land because the Lenape genuinely didn't understand they were supposed to leave forever. To them, you can't sell the earth any more than you can sell the sky. So who scammed whom? The Canarsie pulled off an elaborate real estate fraud. The Dutch imposed a foreign concept of ownership onto a people who never consented to it, and the Wekwijik lost everything. The real scandal isn't the price paid. It's that we've spent 400 years laughing at the wrong people. The Lenape weren't naive. They were operating in an entirely different philosophical universe. History is written by those who remain. And in this story, the only ones who truly lost were the ones we've been calling foolish all along. The greatest trick in this tale wasn't who sold what. It was who controlled the narrative afterward. The story we've been told for centuries was simple. Naive natives, cunning Europeans, and $24 worth of beads. But the truth is far more complex and far more fascinating. The Canarsie people who conducted that famous transaction in 1626 didn't own Manhattan. They knew it. And there's compelling evidence that the Lenape understood exactly what they were doing. They sold land that belonged to the Wekwijik. They accepted payment for territory they had no claim to. In essence, they may have pulled off one of history's first real estate scams. But to call it a scam is to view it through a European lens. The Lenape didn't believe land could be owned at all. To them, this was simply accepting gifts from visitors who misunderstood everything. The Dutch thought they'd purchased property. The Canarsie thought they'd received tribute for allowing temporary use. 2 civilizations speaking the same words, meaning completely different things. When the Wekwijik, the actual inhabitants of Manhattan, showed up demanding their own payment, the Dutch were furious. They'd been duped, they claimed. But had they? Or had everyone simply been trapped in a web of mutual misunderstanding, where concepts of ownership, property, and permanence meant entirely different things to different peoples? The Dutch eventually paid the Wekwijik too, twice the price. But even then, the Lenape never believed they'd sold their ancestral home. How could anyone sell the earth itself? Today, Manhattan is worth over $1.7 trillion, the entire island. We still call that original deal the greatest bargain in history. But who really got the better end? The Lenape lost their homeland, their way of life, everything. The Dutch lost New Amsterdam to the British just 40 years later. The land changed hands again and again, always taken, never truly bought. Perhaps the real scam wasn't who sold what to whom. Perhaps it was the very idea that this land, this island, this sacred space could ever belong to anyone at all. The legacy of that 1626 transaction isn't about beads or guilders or dollars. It's about the collision of worldviews, the violence of misunderstanding, and the stories we tell ourselves about history. We remember the purchase, we forget the theft, we celebrate the deal, we ignore the displacement. History, after all, is written by those who remain. The Lenape people are still here, scattered but unbroken, remembering a different story than the one in our textbooks. A story where the land was never for sale, because it was never ours to begin with. So, who scammed whom in the Manhattan Purchase? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe we should ask, what have we lost by believing land can be bought at all? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.